Students, after studying this module, you will be able to learn the meaning and the consequences of globalization. You will be able to understand the concept of national competitive advantage and also learn major benefits and risks associated with globalization. You will also know how various firms follow what strategies to enter into the markets, particularly the global markets. Let's first of all try to understand the concept of globalization. Swedish journalist Thomas Larsson, in his famous book, The Race to the Top, The Real Story of Globalization, written in 2001, has stated that globalization is the process of world shrinkage. Basically, shrinkage of the distances getting shorter, things moving closer, and it pertains to increasing ease with somebody on one side of the world to interact with a person who is on the other side of the world for mutual benefit. Globalization is not something that happens off and on. It's basically a continuous process which brings together different people, cities, regions, countries, and governments. This concept, the concept of a global village, where people from different countries are linked through trade, services, and are able to utilize the resources in the best possible way. Globalization makes natural and artificial boundaries of the barriers less relevant, and it makes this world a very small place. Initiation of globalization was possibly due to the development in the field of information technology and communication. Developments in the field of communication have created a path for different economies to come together and connect with each other so that resources in one part of the world can be utilized efficiently. Globalization is basically the process that makes the flow of goods, services, people, idea, and capital easier, and it's a way by which you can link all economies together and decrease the artificial barrier which man has created between the people. We have long conceptualized the world as Vishva eva Kutumbakam, the whole world as a one family. So students, globalization is definitely an all-encompassing reality which is happening around us now. Let us try to understand various forms in which globalization takes place. Globalization comes to us in many forms. The most discernible form around us is the globalization of trade. Since ancient period, there was a time when people used to trade across nations. We had a famous Silk Route. We had the goods and services moving from one part of the world to another part of the world. And that was the first initial step of the globalization. The traders of India were traveling around the globe, and India became the place, amongst the most prosperous places in the world. Now the nomenclature has changed, but the basic theme remains the same. Globalization means when the traders and the service providers are providing their goods and services to the people living in different parts of the world. When I drink Pepsi here, which is an American company, the product is available from a foreign company to so many people around the world. That is one form of globalization. The second aspect is the globalization of human resources. Globalization has made possible that human resources can easily move from one country to another country to get jobs, for career, for training, for knowledge, education, etc. Easy mobility of human resources provides competitive edge to the businesses which operate throughout the world. Businesses can easily train their employees in different countries to learn about new technology, and they can adapt it so that the technology can be used in the place where they are working. Another form of globalization is basically the globalization of knowledge. Education is one of the most powerful tools which empowers the people, the masses. And the best part is when we are able to get the knowledge of diverse subjects easily. Globalization of knowledge has provided an opportunity to all the students of the world to enhance their skills and their knowledge. Another form of globalization is the globalization of investments. Investment is one of the most powerful tools which has driven globalization, and it is being used for the development of nations, and overall money is moving from one nation to another nation. Money is required for development of the nations, but every nation may not have the surplus amount of money sufficient for its development. So the funds move in different forms just because they have become easy to move, and globalization has made it easier for the countries to get investment from other nations and use it for their own development. In India, the process of globalization in the recent times is set to start since the new economic policy of 1991. Globalization was one of the most important components of the liberalization, privatization and globalization regime. In this new economic reforms which were introduced, the idea was to make the Indian economy competitive. Before 1991, India faced a huge crisis because of fiscal deficit. Investors were not ready to invest significantly into India. NRIs had lost confidence on the Indian economy. International loans were creating more burdens on the economy. And due to all this, there were problems, and it became imperative for the government to open up the Indian economy to the people and the firms throughout the world, and to provide more opportunities and more competition into the Indian markets, so that ultimately India could become more competitive. In long run, globalization has produced both positive as well as negative effects. Globalization has proved to be a mixed blessing for the Indian economy. So students, let us now discuss the consequences of globalization. Just as we know, everything has got good as well as bad effects, and so is happening with globalization. It's a new buzzword which has been criticized as well as praised. Supporters of globalization say that globalization is the best way to empower the poor countries, the poor people. But another viewpoint for globalization is that the dependence of the developing countries is increasing, and many developing companies may be independent, but because of their economic dependence upon the developed countries, they are losing their sovereignty. Globalization has spread its roots in each and every country, and each and every country is getting influenced because of the globalization. Globalization is leading to the effects happening across nations. One thing happens in a country, its impacts are felt in the other parts of the world as well. So students, let's now try to study some positive effects of globalization. The first and the foremost positive effect of globalization is the competition and efficiency. When one product or service is provided by one or few suppliers, it's not a very good situation for the consumers, because consumers' choices are limited and consumers are not able to get the best product for the value that they offer to the supplier. Globalization has increased the overall competition worldwide. Globalization has increased the efficiency of the world market. And today, sitting in India, it has become possible for us to find out the best product. Today, farmers are able to procure the best products which they want. They are able to sell to anywhere, to the best companies. If you are competent, if you are good, if you can deliver, competition has opened a lot of opportunities, and the young people, young, bright, intelligent boys and girls of our country, they have definitely made a lot of benefit in terms of their career, and the opportunities were created because of globalization. Second major effect of globalization is the movement of capital. For the growth of any country, capital is necessary. And many a times, the internal domestic savings may not be enough. For continuous economic growth, nations need capital, and globalization has paved the way for a smooth flow of capital across the nations. Today, for many countries, foreign capital plays a more important role in the development of a country. Foreign capital can take the form of foreign direct investment and portfolio investment. and the growth of many developing countries, FDI is definitely playing a very significant role. If we look at the globalization as a phenomenon, and if we measure the world trade, we find that it's been because of globalization. The volume of world trade has increased over the years due to globalization. The amount of world trade in 1950 was $296 billion, and today it has increased to $18.3 trillion. That is 62 times increase in just half a century. So definitely there is a very big increase in the volume of trade happening because of globalization. As a consequence of increase in the trade, there is definitely an impact on the economic development. Globalization has definitely brought economic prosperity to the whole world, particularly the countries which are classified as the developing countries. Impact of globalization can easily be seen in a country like India and China. It's due to globalization that tariff rates were reduced in many parts of the world, and the countries were encouraged to have a free flow of the goods and services, which increased the flow of capital, technology, and people into different countries. So the overall development of the developing countries increased because of globalization. There is also an increase in the transfer of technology. Definitely there has been an advancement of technology, and transfer of technology has happened because of globalization. It has made the good technology available to even the developing countries, which earlier was not possible. International companies are opening their offices in form of multinational companies, and foreign nationals are working in them. Hence their knowledge, their skills is adding to the knowledge and skills of even the developing countries. Globalization has also increased the employment opportunities. Large number of MNCs are investing in foreign countries, and they have created more jobs for the people in those developing countries. More employment has increased per capita income of so many developing countries, and the chain effect incrementation in income has raised the standard of living and social welfare of the people in those countries. So students, these are the good things which globalization has brought to us. But now it's not just the one side of the story. Globalization has several negative impacts as well on the world economy. The first and the foremost major negative impact is there is an increased gap between the rich and the poor. Globalization has exposed poor countries to global competition. You know, competition can be between equals. When there is somebody at this level and another at this level, they really cannot compete with each other. And poor nations don't have much capital to fight the international competition. So the result is there's a very big gap between the rich countries on one hand and the poor countries on another hand. Even within a country, there's a gap between the rich individuals at one hand, which are less in number, and a large number of people who do not have that degree of access to the resources and affluence. So this gap has definitely increased. And this is widening as a result of, one of the reasons behind it is the globalization. Second is increased dependence on the developed countries. Globalization has increased the dependence of the developing countries on the developed countries. Whenever developing countries receive any kind of financial aid from any international organization, they have to comply with certain restrictions or certain conditions, and it creates a control over the developing countries, and they usually do not have an option but to comply with them. Another major impact in addition to these economic impacts is that globalization is changing the culture of the world. Globalization sometimes has been criticized for erosion of culture happening because of diffusion of the ideas, values, which are essential components of the culture of nations. Second major impact of globalization, and the next major negative impact of globalization, which is often said is the brain drain. The globalization has increased this problem because highly qualified professionals who are moving from the developing countries to the developed countries, and as a result of this continuous migration, the best brains are not delivering in their home countries, but they are giving their best output in the countries which are already developed. This imposes a great threat for the developing countries in terms of the flight of capital in the form of human capital, the intellectual workforce. So students, let us now study about globalization and the national competitive advantage. Competitiveness of a nation is basically its capacity to innovate and upgrade and to remain relevant and competitive in the global scenario. Nations differ in terms of culture, value, economic structure, national condition, and these factors collectively contribute towards contribution of what is known as the competitive edge for a nation. The very best diamonds are found in South Africa. The answer is that nature has given a gift to that wonderful country. The effect of natural resources can easily be seen in Gulf countries. World supply of oil is controlled by the Gulf countries. Why? Because nature has given the advantage to them. Natural resources also affect the national competitiveness of countries like US. They have abundant technological resources, which makes them ahead from many other nations and gives them a competitive edge in terms of technology intensive products like microprocessor and computer software. So different factors play a different role in different countries to make them more competitive. So national competitive advantage is basically the assessment of a nation's ability to participate competitively in the international markets. In his legendary book, The Competitive Advantage of Nations, Michael Porter has identified that in order to increase the competitiveness of nations, there are some factors, and those factors are firstly the demand condition, the factor condition, the related supportive strategies, and firm's structure and rivalry. Let us try to study each one of them. Demand conditions. Demand conditions refer to the demand for a product or a service in a home country. Demand for a product depends on the need of the consumer, wants and income of the consumer, the size of population. Demand conditions play a very important role in determination of the competitive advantage, not only by the domestic demand for the products which outweighs the foreign demand. When the domestic demand for a product is greater than the foreign demand, then the firms devote more time for the development of the product in that country. The second factor leading to competitiveness of nations is the factor conditions. Factors or resources can be anything. They can be things like human resources, they can be things like material, they can be inputs like technology, capital or skilled resources. Each country has its own particular set of the factors. For instance, India, the competitive advantage can be treated in terms of skilled human resources. The next factor is the firm strategy, structure and rivalry. Within a nation, the structure of companies, the strategies adopted by the rivalries amongst competitors affects the local firms and affects the national competitive advantage of the firms as well. The firms have family business structure. They'll behave in a different manner as compared to a public limited company. Domestic rivalry also plays a very important role in gaining the competitive advantage because high competition amongst domestic producers spurs innovation and creativity. Take the case of iPhone and Android phone. See, it is promoting innovation and it is making US as a top player in the field of providing these gadgets, and it is adding to the national competitive advantage of that country. Then the next important factor which contributes to the competitive advantage of nations is the related and the supporting strategy. Competitive advantage of a country also depends upon a fact that whether a country has the ability to create cluster of industries. Michael Porter has suggested that competitive strength of any country would increase if it had cluster of industries related to each other and these clusters are supporting. Take the case of Denmark. Denmark has a competitive advantage in terms of wind power, but this is possible due to the presence of wind turbine manufacturers, wind farm developers, operators and other utilities which are together contributing towards the development of that industry. So the presence of related and supportive industries is really very essential to gain the competitive advantage. So students, let us now move on and discuss various issues related to globalization. Whether any country adopts the path for globalization towards development, its main intent is to increase efficiency, utilize available resources, create more opportunities, and increase overall prosperity of the country. But what is hidden in future can't be predicted precisely. For some countries, globalization has proved as the best thing that could happen to that country, whereas for some it has been the other way around. The point, overall gains and risks attached with globalization can stop. Let us now discuss the strategies to enter into global markets. As we know, globalization is a process which allows the firms to enter into different markets. There are different ways by which the firms can enter into the global markets. The ways can be divided, these modes of entry can be divided into three basic types. The first type of mode is the trade mode. The second type of the mode is the contractual mode. And third type of the mode is the international direct investment mode. Let us try to understand each one of these modes. Trade mode. When a firm enters into an overseas market through the trade mode, basically the relationship between the firm where it is doing the trade and the nation where it is making an entry, the relation is basically transactional in nature. Just as they buy and sell the goods, it's as simple as that. And this trade mode of entry into overseas market can happen in three different forms. One is the direct trade or indirect export, second is the counter trade, and third type of the trade is the cooperative export. The direct and indirect exporting is basically when the firms set up their own exporting departments for making the goods available to the foreign consumers. Therefore, the ultimate responsibility lies on the firms to sell the products to the international markets. The mode of direct exporting becomes quite desirable, especially when the company or the firm wants to involve itself into the international business. It's just like a starting point, but it's not necessary that the company possesses the capacity to do the same. Therefore, the firms which have capacity and infrastructure, they go for direct exporting. The firms which do not have this, they go for the indirect exporting and may hire the intermediaries to sell their products outside the country. These intermediaries are also known as the export management companies, who undertake the responsibility to make the goods and services available into the international market. The second method of trade mode is the counter trade. Counter trade is a form of a bilateral trade where transactions are set in terms of goods rather than money. Whether it's the shortage of money which exists between a seller or a buyer, or an arrangement on mutual consent, they may not trade in terms of money, but they will trade in the form of the goods. There are different variants of counter trade. For instance, we had the barter, which used to happen very frequently in the olden days. Today it's got very limited applications. Second is the switch trading. Under the switch trading, the seller company agrees that it will purchase from the buyer country in future to fulfill its obligations. Third type of the method in this mode is the counter purchase. In this, the counter purchase is a specific agreement under which the seller company promises that it will purchase a specified amount of product from the buyer in future. Another form of this arrangement is known as buyback. Buyback is a kind of an arrangement in which the firm agrees to build up a plant in one country, supply technology, provide training and all other resources and services, but in return it takes up a fixed percentage out of the plant output as a payment corresponding to setting up the cost of the plant. Another method under this mode is the offset mode, in which agreement by one country is to buy a product from another country, which is subject to the condition that selling country will purchase the raw material or component of the finished product from the buyer country. The third form of the trade mode is the cooperative trade. Cooperative trade is also known as piggybacking. In this situation, under which one company uses the international distribution channel of another country, It's a low cost strategy to enter into international business. But the essential requirement for cooperative trade is that the two companies or the two firms should not be competing with each other, because much success of cooperative trade will depend upon the commitment and honesty of the two firms towards each other. After the trade mode, the second mode of entry is the contractual mode. Contractual mode has different forms. The most common form is the licensing, which is very common. Under this, the firm transfers its intangible assets like technology, expertise, trademark, patent, manufacturing technique, etc. to another firm. The firm which is selling intangible asset is known as licensor, and the firm which is buying this intangible asset is known as the licensee. Licensing is an advantageous agreement for both licensor as well as the licensee. So students, licensor can recover the cost of research and development that has been incurred by them in developing the tangible asset, and at the same time the licensee gets the intangible asset at a low cost. Instead of making it themselves, they are paying some license fee and getting it from somebody else. Under this process, both gain, but the major disadvantage in this process is that the control and secrecy cannot be maintained by the licensor. Licensing usually is time-bound agreement, and after the termination of the contract, it may or may not be renewed by the licensor. Many industries such as, say, software, pharmaceutical, and many other industries are usually operating on this mode. The second mode of entry under the contractual mode is known as the franchising. Franchising is also one of the popular modes which has been widely used by many firms. Franchising is the technical collaboration between one country, which is known one company, one firm, which is known as franchisee. It uses the intellectual property rights like the patent, the trademark, the expertise, or the exclusive procedure to produce a product of another firm, which is known as a franchisor. We all like to have our favorite fast foods like pizzas and burgers. Many of them are operating through the franchising mode. Franchising and licensing seemed to be the same, but there is slight difference between franchising and licensing in terms of its operationalization issues. Franchising provides more control and secrecy as compared to the licensing agreement. If a franchisee fails to follow the rules and guidelines given by the franchisor, then the franchisor has a right to take back the franchisee, which may or may not exist in the case of licensing agreement. The third type of contractual mode is the turnkey project. Under the turnkey projects, one firm agrees to take the full responsibility of designing, construction, and fully equipping a particular plant or a project till the time when the project is finally ready for operation against a fixed price which is going to charge from another firm. This type of arrangement is advantageous to shift the risk of enhanced cost due to inflation. For example, Indian construction of metro project. This is an example of the turnkey project. The third mode of entry into the foreign markets is the international direct investment, in which the firms make the direct investment themselves. There are many forms in which this can be done. One form is the joint venture. Joint venture is a very popular mode of entry into the international markets. Joint venture is a short-term partnership under which two or more organizations join hands to complete a particular venture. Each firm will contribute its assets or its capabilities and finally share the profits and risks which will be associated with the project. The second form of the international direct investment is the wholly owned subsidiary. When a firm known as a parent company owns or controls 100% stock of another company, then it is known as a wholly owned subsidiary company. If a firm wants to have full control over its international operation, then the wholly owned subsidiary is the best mode of entry into the foreign markets. Now, firms have to decide amongst various methods of entering the foreign markets. So students, let us now understand the factors that affect the strategies to enter into the international markets. When an organization decides that it wants to expand itself into the international markets, definitely it's a difficult question of selecting the right mode, because its success will have its long-term strategic implications as well. Basically, the choice of mode of entry into overseas markets depends upon three factors. The first factor is the availability of resources with the firm, which is really most important factor which influences the decision of that organization. Each and every strategy to enter into international trade demands different quantum of resources. So ability and willingness of a firm to devote the resources affects the decisions regarding the mode of entry. The second factor is the desire to maintain the degree of control. The entry mode of international trade depends upon the desired level of control that an organization wants to have over its international operations. And the third variable which influences the choice is the willingness of the organization to bear the risk. Higher the capacity of a firm to bear the risk, the mode of entry it will choose will be different. The factors of entry are also influenced by some other factors, which can be external factors such as the size of the market, the growth rate of the market, the government restrictions, the level of competition, production of shipping costs, etc. There can be some internal factors as well. Internal factors which are specific to a firm, and they can be like the objectives of the firm, the international experience and expertise, and the flexibility which the firm has developed in itself. So with this, students, let us now recapitulate what we have learned so far. Globalization is a process that makes the flow of goods and services, people, ideas, and capital easier by linking all the economies together and decreasing the artificial barriers amongst them. Globalization happens in many forms. It happens in the form of globalization in terms of trade, in terms of human resources, in terms of knowledge, and in terms of investment. In India, the process of globalization started through the implementation of new economic policy in 1991. Globalization was one of the important components of the LPG model, that is the liberalization, privatization, and globalization. Globalization has positive as well as negative effects, and the supporters of globalization say that globalization is the best way to empower the poor countries and the poor people. But another viewpoint for globalization is that dependence of developing countries is increasing over the developed countries, because of which developing countries are losing their sovereignty. Due to globalization, competition has increased at all the levels everywhere in the world, which in turn has raised the level of efficiency. Capital can easily flow from countries and the volume of trade has increased. Even the developing countries are now getting access to technology. GDP of developing countries has also shown a positive increase, and the employment opportunities have increased worldwide. However, globalization has also increased the gap between the rich and the poor. The problem of brain drain has increased, and some countries have felt that their culture has been negatively affected as a result of globalization. Nations differ in terms of their culture, values, economic structure, natural conditions, and all these factors collectively contribute towards the competitive edge. So students, we have learned that globalization has opened many opportunities, and at the same time it has also led to some threats for the emerging economies, and there are advantages of scale and monopoly, and at the same time there are risks related to global health, level of competition, etc. Students, we have also learned various modes of entry by which firms can enter into the overseas markets. Thank you.